welcome on behalf of the National Press Club and the National Press Club Journalism Institute. We're so happy that you're joining us tonight for this program. I'm Julie Moose. I'm Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, where we are working to close the gap between journalism and civic engagement. And tonight's program really meets that mission head on. The most important journalism that happens in this city is done by regional reporters. Yay. Should I say it again? I really believe it. The most important journalism that happens in the city is done by regional reporters. Regional reporters are watching Washington for America's hometowns so that the people of the United States can make informed decisions about their lives and about their democracy. And this type of journalism and the self-government that it enables is one of the most important reasons we have a First Amendment protection for freedom of the press. So on this 30th anniversary of the Regional Reporters Association, you're going to hear about the challenges reporters face. You already know what they are: shrinking resources, diminished public trust, and growing fake news. But you're also going to hear about the impact of regional reporting from some of the very, very best in the business on this panel and in this room. And we're going to look ahead to the future of regional reporting. And as we look at the future of journalism, it will rest in the hands of people like tonight's moderator, Tamar, Hellerman, who is the Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, president of the Regional Reporters Association, and a very valued member of the National Press Club. So thank you, Tamar, for the conversation we're about to have, and thank you all again for being here tonight.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Tamar Hellerman from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and as Julie mentioned, I'm the president of the Regional Reporters Association. RRA is a professional development group for print, TV, and radio reporters. We all cover DC for news organizations based outside the Beltway. We formed 30 years ago under the idea that we could offer tips and pointers to one another without compromising competition. And we also found that, we could secure more interviews with high-profile newsmakers if we actually worked together. And we've had some pretty cool opportunities over the last 30 years. As regional reporters, we're facing the same pressures as every other reporter in DC. From the White House to federal agencies and Capitol Hill, media access is tightening. The president regularly seeks to undermine our credibility. Public trust in the media has been on the decline. And doctored videos and stories sprouting up online are not making our lives any easier. But we regional reporters also face our own unique challenges. Craigslist, Facebook, and free online news sites have taken massive bites out of the local news business, and a lot of our parent companies are tightening their belts. Many have closed or consolidated their Washington bureaus and laid off some really well-connected reporters in the process. I would know. My newspaper is owned by Cox Media Group, which 2 decades ago had about 24 reporters based in the Washington bureau covering politics and policy. With a sale that's expected to go through at the end of the year, I'll soon be the sole Cox reporter based in DC. We all know the work that regional reporters do is vitally important to democracy. No one else keeps close tabs on state congressional delegations like we do, and the local impact of federal policy like we do. And with the closing of small and medium-sized newspapers across the country, our work is as essential as ever. And that leads me to today and our great panel that we have. I want to look at how the landscape for regional reporting has changed since RRA was created 30 years ago, and how we can rebuild trust and best inform our readers at a time when civil discourse seems to be cratering. On that note, I'd like to introduce our panel. I have Mark Barthel from the Pew Research Center. His work focuses on public opinion of the news media, journalism, and social media. We have Jerry Zremski, the Washington bureau chief of the Buffalo News. He's been covering DC for 30 years, almost exactly as long as RRA has been around. And he's produced some really amazing work lately having to do with Congressman Chris Collins. And we also have 2 distinguished former members of Congress who've been kind enough to join us, and I really hope they can give us candid views on what it's like being covered by annoying regional reporters like us. We have Congressman Jim Moran, a Democrat who represented a Northern Virginia House district for 24 years before retiring in 2015. Before getting elected to Congress, he was mayor of Alexandria, Virginia, and now he's at the firm McDermott, Will & Emery. Next to him, we have former Congressman Ryan Costello, a Republican who represented a Philadelphia area district for 2 terms and retired last year. After leaving Congress, he started his own public policy and strategic communications firm. So thank you so much for being here. And just some housekeeping before we begin. I'll keep an eye out in case anybody has questions, and we do want this to be a conversation with the room. I'm also going to save a robust amount of time at the end for questions. I want to hear about people's experiences, being regional reporters and how people have adapted in this new environment. So with that, let's begin. Jerry, I want to start with you. You've been a regional reporter in DC since 1989. So I was wondering if you could paint a picture for us about how your job has changed over the years. I'm sure you're spending a lot less time on, with the fax machine and a lot more time on Twitter.
Yeah, things have really changed. When I got here, I covered a congressman named Bill Paxton, and I called him Faxon Paxson because I got so many faxes. Obviously, that has changed. The changes I think that regional reporters face are very similar to what reporters face generally. First of all, we're filing all the time now. If something is breaking, I file it right away, or I tweet it right away. So I kind of feel like my job never ends now. And yet at the same time, there are certain kinds of coverage that I've pulled back from. When I got here, I was part of a 2-person bureau, and we really tried to cover everything. If we had a member of Congress who chaired a committee, we would try to go to all the hearings and cover those hearings. And over time, we cut back. I'm the only reporter now, and I'm really tasked with doing mostly enterprise work that's going to either end up on the front page of the print paper or get a ton of hits online. And one can ask, is this a good change? Is this not a good change? I'm uncertain. It really would be great to still be able to be the newspaper of record in Washington for Buffalo, New York. But at the same time, I think regional reporters can also, and I've seen this happen, get too much into the weeds and not write the really good, important impact stories about what's really happening for their readers and what the delegation is really doing. So the way regional reporting has changed for me is I've gone much more into that direction, much more away from process stories.
Does social media make your job easier or harder? Because in a way, you know the second that somebody like Congressman Costello tweets, we can get that instantly.
Right. It's made it both easier and harder. It's made it such that I have to be alert to social media, and I have to follow it all day long, and I have to use it when appropriate. But so that's made it more complicated. It's more, like I said, I feel like I'm never not working. But the good thing about it is I do feel much more interconnected. A lot of reporters say, don't read the comments, right? Well, I read the comments, and believe it or not, I get stories from the comments. And I'll give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I did a story about the delays in the construction of a new veterans cemetery in Western New York. And there was like this vague comment from a guy who said, I'm a veteran, and I own a business, and I wish the government would stop trying to help me. So I figure I'm going to reach out to this guy. And I do. And it turns out he tells me all about these rules that I did not know about, legislation that Congress passed in 2006 that required that this cemetery be built by a company owned by a veteran with a service-connected disability. Well, they're having a hard time finding a company that qualifies. So I got a really good front page story only because of social media, only because I could interact with a reader that I would not have probably even heard from 30 years ago.
So I want to hear from the 2 former congressmen now. I'm interested because both of you served in local government before you made it to Capitol Hill. Congressman Costello, you were on the Chester County Board of Commissioners. Do I have that right? And Mr. Moran, you were mayor of Alexandria, and I believe you're also on the city council. So you've dealt with local reporters. You get to Washington. You guys both have regional reporters covering you for hometown audiences, and then you also have national reporters who all of a sudden are also interested in you. So I'm curious what that's like, and particularly how your relationships with the regional press might have differed from some of those other reporters.
You want to go? All right.
Whichever you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an excellent question, and one thing I want to sort of lay out preliminarily is, for as frustrating as it might be as a regional reporter to deal with the changes in the industry, I found it very frustrating as an elected official because the rules of the game have changed. And so by that I mean the cultivation of a relationship with a reporter. I'm looking to earn your trust that what I'm saying is actually true. I'm looking to earn your trust that what I'm working on is something that might be newsworthy. You know, the generation of stories to feed for your consideration, so that over a period of years, your local electorate is reading your independently verified recitation of what I'm doing to validate me as an elected official, as someone who's working hard, is really, that is the nutrition that a politician needs in order to withstand a wave, right, in a wave election year, and to engender goodwill in the community. I mean, soccer practice, kids in school, professional life, people don't pay attention to what we're doing very often. And so for decades, and up through I was in public service starting when I was 25, I'm 42 now, that I was kind of schooled in that era. And then, Twitter, right? 2015, 2016, where it really seems that the way to get your message out has changed, and less people are buying a newspaper or relying on regional reporters and, in my case, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and even more local papers, which have all been bought up by one of the 3 or 4 hedge funds out there. It becomes a real challenge. And I would submit that because the rules of the game have changed, there are some elected officials who saw it coming, and I'll get into this a little later because I don't want to talk too much here at the inception of this, but some politicians saw that coming and got in front of it with stuff that clicks, clickbait and stuff that creates sensationalism, and some who I would argue are better at doing what the Constitution prescribes that they actually do, don't know what the new rules of the game are, and they suffer. And I would actually argue that our democracy suffers as a consequence of the breakdown in elected officials' accountability by print media, consumption of print media by citizens in elected officials' constituency. And for as much as it's a business challenge for your industry, I think it's a real credibility challenge for elected officials to break through to their constituency in a way when you don't have citizens relying on the service that you provide as a part of a business model, and as frankly as under the First Amendment as what it was contemplated that a free press would do in an open society.
Congressman Moran, you were in Washington for a very long time, and social media came about kind of your last couple years. Did you find that you were changing what you were talking to your constituents about, or what people wanted from you? The inquiries you were getting from your constituents, were they becoming more nationalized as there were fewer regionals around to talk to?
Yes. The problem with social media, and I don't mean this in the way in which it'll be perceived, but there's no way to regulate it. And as a result, you don't know what you're getting. You don't know who's sending it. You don't know how representative it is. You don't even know, whether it really is a person. It could be a bot. And so it's unreliable, it's untrustworthy, and I don't think it's particularly informative, and invariably it's superficial. The tweets, the emails that you get now, they're overwhelmed with people who just have snarky comments to make, thoughtless for the most part. So it's not a substitution for anything. people vet. And oftentimes it's disgruntled people who, I mean, there was a time when people would write a letter to you and, you know, it was really off base. And we would send a form letter back. We regret to inform you that someone is using your name and sending misguided letters. If we find out who it is, I mean, if it was particularly bad, we'd say if we find out who it is, we will refer them to the Mental Health Institute. But you can't do that anymore, you know, because it's just too much. I just don't find that social media, for the most part, is terribly informative.
Yeah.
Now, I represent Northern Virginia, which was part of the Washington metro area, so most people get the Washington Post. In the communities, though, and fortunately these local papers are still surviving, we would still have local papers, and the local papers serve an extraordinarily important purpose, particularly from the perspective of a politician. For the Post, and the Post is better than most, frankly, so I don't want to single out the Post in any negative way. It really is, it's a very good paper. That and the New York Times are the two, as far as I'm concerned, the two best papers and most reliable papers in the world. But it's tough to get space, even on the metro section, unless there's a scandal. If there is a scandal or a very controversial policy issue, you will get space. But if you're a well-run government that's doing the right thing, that's responsive, that's competent, that's taking issues as they come, deliberating on them, and acting responsibly, you're never going to get your name mentioned. Forget about it. Your only hope is to have a network of personal friends and just to go to every possible reception and every soccer game and so on. That's not a bad thing, but you're never going to get any press. And it makes you vulnerable because when you do mess up, and everybody's human, people don't know all the good things that you have done. And that's just a function of the fact that, you know, there are, 7 million people, I guess, in the wider Washington metro area, but in a community, there's maybe 100,000 at most. A small fraction of that would actually get the paper. And unless you have a critical mass, you can't even get advertising revenue. And so the cohesiveness of community itself and the motivation for elected representatives to work hard, to serve the people, and to get some amount of credit for doing so is lost. And some communities, it's probably gone forever. And I do think that erodes the whole concept of de Tocqueville, that, you know, we are a country that's built upon local democracy. You have to have local coverage.
On that note, I want to bring in Mike, because at Pew, you've done a lot of research into local and regional and national journalism trends. And recently you did a really cool, I don't know if widget's the right term, but you had a really cool thing where you could search by metropolitan area and kind of see the local news ecosystem of different towns. And you could see all of these insane news deserts everywhere. So can you talk to me a little bit kind of about some of the trends you've seen in local and regional news around the country?
Sure. Yeah, and that tool is available at journalism.org if you want to punch in your local area and see what the results are. We actually have, for some of the larger ones, people can give their main source of news, and there are bus ads here in DC from the local Fox station, because it was named as the #1 main source for local news of people in the DC region. So they've capitalized on that and put it on the metro buses, which is great. So yeah, we do find that, the trends for newspapers, especially over the last 30 years, have been kind of a downward trend. Ad revenue has fallen by half, circulation has fallen by half, newsroom staffing has fallen by half just over the last 10 years. And so today, actually, more people get news from social media than from print. So it's risen that much, and that's not even taking into account kind of websites and apps. So taken together, online sources have started to rival TV as kind of Americans' #1 source of news. The good news for local news is that local news organizations are more highly trusted than national news organizations, and much more highly trusted than social media. Only about 4% of Americans say they have a lot of trust in social media. But those numbers kind of highlight the challenges too, to a certain extent, because lots of people are getting news from social media but don't trust it. So we asked folks, what do you like about getting news on social media? And overwhelmingly what we heard was convenience. People like that they can just pick up their phone and open it up, and there's kind of a stream of news there for them to kind of sample from whenever they have a free moment. So newspapers are, to a certain extent, making the digital transition better than some of the other sectors. Their audience is about half and half digital versus their legacy product, whereas for TV and radio, it's more like 75-25, so they're still more dependent on kind of broadcast. But the internet is just definitely coming up from behind. We have seen a decline in the number of regional reporters covering Congress that are coming from daily newspapers. So the number from daily newspapers fell over about a 5-year period. And we did see a rise, but it was from what we called niche outlets. So that'd be stuff like Roll Call, Bloomberg, or trade publications, as well as a slight rise, obviously, in digital native news sites. So we did this back in 2015, so probably the digital native stuff is even higher now. But having that regional correspondent really does seem to make a difference. The papers where a story was written by a regional correspondent, they were much more likely to cover Congress and obviously quote from a member of Congress. So if that trend continues, then that would have implications for the coverage that folks are seeing back home.
Yeah, and those trends you mentioned are reflective in the members that we have in RRA. 20 years ago we had 230 members, and now we're down to about 65. So I mean, that's hard to hear. We still are getting new people, and that's wonderful. But I do want to talk a little bit about what this downward trend, the repercussions of all of that. Jerry, you've done some pretty amazing work digging into Congressman Collins and some of his financial, stock trades that he was making that maybe weren't so kosher. And stories like that might not be covered. But, so if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk to the congressman as well about how, because of the decline of local news, how that's changed, the way that folks have interacted with you, even with fewer local news sources. So let's start with you, Jerry, and go from there.
Yeah, I do think that basically you have a situation where Congress is a very complicated animal, right? A lot of things are happening in Congress all the time, and all of these members are out there raising money to get reelected. So there is potential, and I'm not one of those reporters who really believes that people come here to Congress to make money or to make it for themselves. I really think there are a lot of very good public servants. But there are those who do things that are untoward. And if there are not regional reporters covering them, I think that the odds of those untoward things being reported are probably much lower. So I don't think it's a good thing for democracy. I think that it's a very good thing to have checks and balances in every way, and I think an independent press that's well resourced can provide that kind of a check. And I don't know where it'll go eventually. I just wonder if there will be more scandal over time, simply because in some communities people aren't watching the store.
I want to talk to Congressman Costello really briefly. When we were chatting, you mentioned how in your district you had something like 5 local newspapers, and 4 out of 5 were bought by a hedge fund, and then the 5th just closed its doors?
Yeah, so Delco Times in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, Pottstown Mercury in Montgomery County, Times Herald in Montgomery County, Daily Local News in Chester County are all now owned by a hedge fund. And the Reading Eagle, which I thought was going to make it, is now been gobbled up by the same one. And so what you have is, rather than each one of those papers leading on the front page with their municipal news, local interest stories, weather, all the typical stuff, now 80% of the stories in each one of those papers is identical to what's in the other. there's maybe a local beat reporter doing some municipal news, but it is, for all intents and purposes, the same paper. And growing up, that was, something I always enjoyed the public service route, always wanted to do it. You learn about your local officials in that paper, and you see the ones that move up the ladder and what they do and how they go about, I don't want to say manipulating the local paper, but like making sure they're in the local paper, right? I mean, there's an art to making sure you're in that local paper. Like if I know that you're covering, the pretty puppy competition every single year, I'm going to go to the pretty puppy competition, right? If you're going to go to cover whatever, I'm going to go to that. And that it can drive a little bit of what your district work schedule is. And one other point I want to make, I don't know if you did it or someone else, but if you look in terms of local governments that are in areas where there's news deserts tend to borrow more money, right? You start seeing these trends related to government behavior that aren't necessarily good, or at least without that accountability and not knowing why certain decisions are made, it just introduces more potential for wrongdoing, or the potential for wrongdoing to happen, which I think also needs to be mentioned. But yeah, all 5 of them within the last 10 years, and a couple of them within the last 2 years.
A question for you and Congressman Moran. I'm wondering if you guys, you talked a little bit about social media, but I'm wondering if you noticed a difference over time in the way that your constituents were interacting with you, or the kinds of questions or issues that they really cared about, given kind of the decline in local news over the years.
Well, it's part of a broader trend. Politics has been nationalized. I spent most of my 24 years in the Congress on the Appropriations Committee. And I guess it was parochial, but I was very proud of that fact, because it's one of the 2 prerogatives that the Constitution grants the legislative branch. We've obviously abdicated the responsibility to declare war. We don't want to do that. But the other is the power of the purse. And the reason why the Congress had the power of the purse is so they could serve their individual communities as best they could, and recognize and represent the diversity of those communities. And they would know best what was most needed, whether it be schools or roads or bridges or human infrastructure kinds of things, training programs and so on, whatever it be. And then they'd go and fight for it. And for the better part of 200 years, members were largely judged on how well they served the interests of their community. Then, I really think it started to come in when Newt came in '94. There was a nationalization of congressional politics. And it became much more partisan. Both sides engaged in a lot of gotcha politics. And then to show that we were purer than Caesar's wife, we eliminated earmarks. So the appropriations process was it was abdicated basically to the leadership. And President Obama was as responsible as any of the Republican presidents. He said any bill that has, appropriation bill that has an earmark in it, I'll veto. So he never got a regular appropriation bill in 8 years. We would shut down the government, we'd have continuing resolutions, we'd kick the can down the road, and then the leadership on both sides, the House, Senate, Republican and Democratic, would get together. There'd be about 8 of them, and they'd work out the spending bills. And there'd be virtually nothing for individual members to to write home about, to go home about, to cut ribbons. And I remember being so stunned after the economic recession of 2008 when President Obama put $980 billion stimulus into the economy. But he decided not to work with the Congress in deciding how that should be spent. He went to the governors was a little surprised, since 2/3 of the governors were Republican, and so, but the members got no credit for anything. And yet they knew best what was most important for their district. So that combined with gerrymandering, where the many elections are determined by the primary process. Elections are nationalized on cultural issues largely. And so this divide has widened. It's the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat now. Every year the gulf widens. And it is relevant to these local newspapers. I guess if you can't bring anything home now, it doesn't really matter if there's nobody to cover it anyway. What's the point of it? But I think this all falls into the same trend, Tamar, that we're nationalizing issues. As the economy becomes concentrated through more and more mergers, acquisitions, concentration of corporate wealth, concentration of personal wealth, and concentration of political issues at the national level instead of what I think is a more proper role for at least the House of Representatives to serve the interests of their individual district. And issues like the cultural issues are irrelevant largely. Mm-hmm. Most members spent their time serving their district, and they were almost invulnerable as long as they worked hard for their district. Now they can get defeated on one cultural issue if they're on the wrong side of it.
Yeah, Congressman Costello,
So,
yeah.
I'll give you an example in terms of, how does it alter behavior? So probably about 5 months into President Trump's term, he comes into the Capitol basement, House Republican Conference meeting, and we were getting whipped on some vote. I can't remember what it was, and obviously the Freedom Caucus is, trying to do something. And so Trump comes in, President comes in and says, what, not terribly substantive, but says, we're going to need to do this, and if we don't get this done, I always got this, I'll tell you what, this Twitter thing, I just go doom, 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 boom, it's like an explosion, right? And what he was saying is he has Twitter, and if you don't get in line, he's going to tweet, and it causes a big, huge explosion. And if you are a Republican, it does. Now, it does for everybody these days, but at the time, that is a whole hell of a lot more compelling, not necessarily for me, but for many Republicans in very Republican districts that, if you want to be held accountable, the president will hold you accountable, and that's instantaneous, right? So tens of thousands of your voters in 5 minutes or an hour have been told whether, where's my congressman on this, right? That, when you think about it, vis-a-vis a regional reporter, which probably comes out the next day in print publication with declining readership, right? And so if you ask, and people say, why don't Republicans stand up to the president, or what is it going to take to get Republicans? Well, who are their voters? Where are they getting their information? And who influences how they think? And is those who influence how they think perceptive enough to know how to push the right buttons? And the flip side of that, was in a very competitive district, healthcare debate. So there are more, and all of you know this, and it probably drives you as crazy as it drove me. There are more websites that pretend to be news sites that are just not news sites. But they look like it, right? The font, everything looks like, and then you read it and you're like, and you would read it or I would read it and be like, this is a joke, this is inaccurate. But a reader doesn't necessarily know fact from fiction. And the cottage industry of ideological left and ideological right news sites, which I call infotainment, really, it's not hard news, and their ability to influence readers who arguably want to be informed but seek to be informed with the predispositions that they already have is a real difficult thing to overcome. And so then you have folks calling the office or messaging you or writing emails that are really either, sometimes they'll attach the article and say, how dare you do this? And you want to say back, like, I didn't do that. That's just, well, this is what the news said. I'm like, that's not the news. Or they'll use a lot of the same talking points. And that's what drives congressional attitudes and behaviors and responses is where their constituents are getting their news.
With that in mind, did you find that it even made sense to message on really local issues, or you could get more attention just to go on Twitter?
Well, the question is whether you want attention. I mean, it is a multimedia. A communications director in this day and age in a House office is different than it was 10 years ago. I was there 4 years. It was different from 4 years ago to my last year, just because I think particularly Twitter has really just taken off more so, and reporters. All of you have to be on Twitter, right? It's not the end-all, be-all, but you have to be everywhere, right? So you do need to do the good government. We got funding for this. You do need to get the statements out on if you disagreed with the DOL executive order that came. You have to do it all, and you have to be everywhere on everything because your voters, particularly in a competitive district, you have to worry about the 500 that care about this and the 700 that care about that. If you're in a really Republican or a really Democratic district, these days it's defined by one thing. Do you support the president or don't you? Are you for impeachment or aren't you? And why not? We've really simplified, I think, to the detriment of a well-informed citizenry, but we've really simplified how we go about measuring our members of Congress. I think the pendulum will swing back, but at the moment, that's where I think we are.
Well, I'm going to open it up to questions in a few minutes, but before I do that, one last question for the panel. I don't think, we wouldn't be here if we didn't think this kind of work was important. But the problem is, of course, nobody, all our big bosses, none of the big fancy people who make millions of dollars have figured out how to make news profitable yet. So, assuming we're not going to get a whole bunch of resources to be able to get back to where we were, how do we adapt? How do we do smart work and rebuild trust, especially, given the state of our public discourse right now? And I want to start with Mike, because Pew has done some research looking at what people want in their news.
Yeah, I mean, so it's very practical stuff. They want the news to be accurate. They want the news to cover stories thoroughly. They do want the news to be kind of fair. They emphasize that there's that one kind of higher ethical consideration. But a lot of it is they just want to provide information that's useful to you. And when we ask people, what sort of local news topics are you interested in? Weather came in at number one, traffic, crime, these very bread and butter local issue. Government was about in the middle there. So people do, to a certain extent, want news that's useful to their lives, and that's kind of, people sometimes talk about wanting news that's more positive, not as kind of negative on things. But it's tough because a lot of the smaller local outlets are going away. Mostly weekly papers so far, but we're starting to see some of the daily papers fade as well. And we do see that local TV is still the #1 source for people's local news in America. But those local TV markets are huge, and so like in Philadelphia, people will say TV. They get a lot of local news from TV, but out in Allentown, which is kind of at the fringes of the market, print and online really does dominate. So news is, especially local news, is very unevenly distributed in America. And so some folks have tried to kind of step up and do digital native sites, but when you look at kind of directories of digital only sites, they're very concentrated on the coasts. There's not a ton in the middle of the country, or even like slightly into the country, like the mid-Atlantic. And so, there's a question of funding there, there's a question of economics. And when we asked people, do you get local news from these digital-only outlets, very, very few people said so. You much more commonly found kind of citizen-oriented stuff like next-door groups, Facebook groups, newsletters, emails, even stuff like local churches and PTA. So people are self-organizing local news to a certain extent, which has always been part of local news is people talking to each other over the back fence. But there so far don't seem to be a ton of outlets coming up to replace what's being lost.
Jerry, anything that you've seen that's kind of been working for you and your editors and your readers?
Yeah, basically I think we all as reporters have always had to kind of balance what we think our readers need to know with what we think they would like to read. And what's struck me over time as I look at my stories and how they perform online, and we can do that now, a lot of times the stories that you would think might not resonate online because they're complicated. If they're written in a way that says, this is how it's going to affect you, it really does resonate. For example, one of my best read stories of the past month is about climate change and the effects that climate change would have on the Great Lakes. It was a panel discussion. I went to it, I asked some questions, and it turned into a really good, very well-read story. So I think as long as you're taking government and you're relating it to the public, there will be an audience for that. And I think it's also important not to make presumptions of your audience that kind of degrade them or disrespect them. And I'll give you a quick example of that, and we all do it. I did a story a couple of months ago. I thought, oh, everybody's going to read this. This is cute. This is a guy from Buffalo who's the Easter Bunny at the White House. Nobody read it. Nobody cared. It was like my worst read story of the month. So that's just a lesson to me that sometimes you think that things are being dumbed down, that people will like that. Not in my experience. In my experience, the really good, meaty stories that are written in a way that people can relate to them, they still work online, at least at the Buffalo News.
Yeah. Congressman, any thoughts on what we can do to improve civil discourse or anything like that?
It's just getting worse.
Yeah.
No, it starts at the top here in this country, and the standard that it is far worse than anything I could have ever imagined. There is no civil discourse. It's uncivil. But even the Democrats are uncivil in their discourse because of the political environment and ego and selfishness and so on. I think it takes leadership, and it takes professionalism in various fields. We used to have, and I don't mean that we don't have very good television anchors, but it used to be that there was people who kind of set the standard. The president would set a standard. We would have 3 or 4 nightly newscasters who would set a standard. They had a certain amount of gravitas. They'd be balanced. You could trust them. And I don't mean that we don't have it now, but there'd be some opinion writers that you would consistently read to be informed, but also to help shape your judgment. And we had fewer flamethrowers. We had more people who kind of saw the broad issue and perhaps lent more respect to different sides. I think we've lost some of that. One of the things that I worry about particularly, because I do believe that journalism is an integral element of community, of civil discourse, of reasoned debate, of competent government. It's foundational. I'd love to find out what's happening in the good schools of journalism, whether this is a profession that bright young people want to get into, to follow your lead, because it seems to me they look around and they think, not much respect, not much opportunity, not much pay. Maybe I want to look at a different profession. And I do think that erodes the kind of larger community that, I think most of us would like to think that it defines the United States.
Can I just hop in on that for 1 second? I also teach at the University of Maryland as an adjunct. And one interesting thing that's happened since Trump's election is just the opposite of what you might be thinking is happening. We've had a bump up of enrollment at the University of Maryland, and they've had to hire more adjuncts to teach more classes because a certain number of young people have become very energized, just the way I was reading about Watergate in 1974. And that's just very interesting. So now, do they get jobs? I worry about that. I certainly do. But you know, the ones I've taught in the last year have been very engaged and very excited about the profession. So.
Well, that's terrific. I mean, I'm not about to say thank God for President Trump, but I think, that's encouraging news. That's terrific.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
All right, well, I'd like to open it up to questions. We have a microphone going around in the back. And if you could please identify who you work for too, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Karen Nauman. I am a communications member of the National Press Club, and I've enjoyed this, and a former journalist. So I've enjoyed the perspective of the politicians, but I think there's another perspective not being considered, and that's of the public relations and public affairs professionals, because when we do grassroots, represent clients that want to do grassroots efforts throughout the nation, we have less local papers to do it, so therefore, it's hard to justify them investing in doing that if they're not going to be covered for their efforts. So then it becomes more consolidated in big cities, and it's also more difficult, as you know, to then get good coverage in a large paper like the New York Times or Washington Post. So I just wanted to bring that additional perspective to this issue to the panel.
Thanks. I think we got one over there.
Hi, I'm Maria Rescio. I write for the Austin American-Statesman, and I also contribute to Texas Monthly. And I wanted to give an example that actually involves Congressman Moran. I doubt that he remembers this, but in an area that we haven't covered, and that's another branch of government, the judiciary. There are many court cases that are extremely important. They are almost always generated from any of our regional areas. And the big one, and I did get to cover Bush v. Gore. The big ones are covered, but there are lots of very important critical cases that aren't. And I can give an example of an extremely local one, at the risk of dating myself. When Congressman Moran was actually mayor, I interviewed him because there was a court case. I was writing for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram at the time, and there was a court case involving the city manager who had been the city manager of Alexandria, who then became the city manager of Fort Worth, Doug Harmon. And as it happened, this was way before the Me Too era, but I believe it was a sexual harassment type issue and discrimination case. And I'm pretty sure he won that case after all.
Yeah, he wouldn't have won it today, frankly, and it was kind of par for the course. But he was a good city manager,
And he continued for many years in Fort Worth, too. But anyway, so it's good to see you again, Congressman.
It's great to see you. Thank you. I had forgotten about that.
Can I just interject on that on one point? It made me kind of think back and realize that back in the day when I had someone working with me in the Bureau, I covered a lot of Supreme Court cases. I covered Supreme Court cases sometimes like I cover bills in Congress, and how does this affect Buffalo? That's something I've really cut back on, being the only person here. And I feel bad because I think it is, you're right, it is very important, but you have to cut somewhere. And that's one place where I felt like I've had to do it.
Any other questions?
Hi, it's Thomas Burr with the Salt Lake Tribune. So I really want to get to a point that maybe would be positive. What is the future for regional reporting? Is it things like MinPost or the Texas Tribune that are online only, niche publications? What is there a positive future that can be found out there, Jerry, Tamar? That's not a good sign.
Well, I'll try, and then I hope others will try too. But I don't think we know what the economic model is going to be for local journalism, and I think it's going to really depend on a lot of very different factors in different areas. I think, frankly, regional newspapers like mine are somewhat advantaged in that we've got, enough people. We have professional sports teams. People subscribe, frankly, just for our sports coverage. Smaller communities, I think, are the ones that are going to really suffer. And yet there are places like Watertown, New York. We have Mark Heller, who covered for the Watertown paper. It's really a company town with a military base. And Mark had a ton of stuff to do here, and there would still be there'd still be a ton for a Watertown reporter to do, but there isn't that person anymore because of the economics. So The economics will shake itself out somehow. I think regional reporting will survive. It will probably continue to shrink some. It may just end up being kind of a major market thing, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer either, but one thing I find just in my own insecurity, for my own job security's sake is, I'm spending my time hyper local. What is the thing that the AP won't have that, what is the Wire not going to have? I'm going to do that unique story so I can prove to my bosses and my corporate honchos that it's still worth having somebody here.
Yeah, and I mean, so there's a lot of very local media that is not, I don't think, making a ton of money, and a lot of it's at the neighborhood level. So here in DC, there's the Prince of Petworth. Back when I was in Seattle, there was a Capitol Hill blog I read all the time, which is operating at kind of a smaller geographic level than the local paper would have been, but it's still breaking a lot of very local stories. And there's also now, again, like I said, the kind of the next door groups and the Facebook groups where people are just posting like, hey, I saw this out my window. What's going on? And somebody else says, I'm on the police scanner. This is happening. So and again, none of us is making money from this, but the news is to a certain extent getting out there. It's just kind of different standards.
I saw a tweet today. It said, today's the first of the month. Choose your online articles wisely.
Oh.
You know what I mean? Because you get the 10 free ones. And I chuckled, and at the same point in time, I buy newspapers, right? Because I believe in it. I'm sure everybody in this room does, and a lot of people do. But consumers are fickle, and it's fleeting, right? Like some other piece of information is going to come along 5 minutes later. And the ability, I think, of particularly the regional reporting network, and I'm not a reporter, but to weave the national with the local in a way that only you can do, that's the sweet spot. We have national reporters to do national, people can find that information elsewhere, but that's the value proposition. The question is, how do you sustain and create a moat around that business model so that the sophisticated consumer can't get away with getting it for free over and over and over again.
Something that makes me particularly nervous as a millennial is that I find that a lot of my friends, since Trump has been elected, they subscribe to the Post and the Times for the first time, which is great. That's really good, but I don't see the same enthusiasm for local news. It hasn't been ingrained in them, maybe because they're young and they're finally settling down in one city
Wait
for the first time.
Wait till their parents, right?
Yeah, exactly, but that's something I always try and tell people, please subscribe to the local paper too, not just the Post and the Times.
Yeah, so we asked folks if they paid for local news directly in the last year, and only about 14% of US adults had done so. We also asked the question, how well do you think your local news is doing financially? And about 70% of folks said their local news was doing well financially.
Wow.
Wow. So that may or may not be an issue. There was a story in the Times today about a local paper in Michigan that actually a few months before they just folded, printed a whole issue where the front page was blank, and it just said, this is what it'll look like if you don't support the paper. So that's, I think, something to be aware of in terms of what the public has on their mind.
I would guess,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to pivot to the next question, so
Well,
go aheed.
I would guess that we're going to wind up with two variants, and this is not going to, not going to edify the discussion anymore. I'm trying to think of positive things, but we need to be honest about it. One might be what was called the patch. It was very local. It was online. We had good reporters. They covered a lot of good stuff, but it wasn't a business model that was sustainable economically. But I think it might come back because it makes sense. But the other variant is just like Ryan was talking about, your hedge funds or whatever source of capital comes in, they buy them up, they create a monopoly, and they do it across the country. And then they operate somewhat like Sinclair. That's not a Sinclair camera there, is it? But you buy up so many stations that you have a core content of news. In Sinclair's case, and it's not as bad locally as it is, but there is a political bent. But you have a core content of news, and then you have maybe 20% of the paper is local. So you could claim that it's a local paper, but it's really just an iteration of the same stuff that they're putting in every regional paper that they own. And, you know, that's not a positive development, but it seems to me from an economic standpoint, that may be one of the only things that's going to be economically sustainable to do it that way.
We have another question in the crowd.
Meredith Wadman, I'm a reporter with Science Magazine, used to be with the Oakland Tribune. Question for Michael or any of the other panelists if they want to weigh in. I'm curious about why the digital-only publications, you said, seem to thrive just on the coasts, and can you connect the dots on that and why that is and what we might learn from that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think that's a good question. There's certainly lots of cities that are on the coast that have, you know, very digital and digitally enabled folks. Certainly, a lot of times the phrase is actually nonprofit online, so it may be to a certain extent an issue of where the funding is going and where the funders are interested. But you know, I mean, the local news is great to study because every place has its own story. And so Philadelphia, the local news organization decided to become a nonprofit and try that business model, and so they're trying that as well. So yeah, I'm not quite sure about that answer, and if other folks know, that'd be great.
I think one factor may just be the demographics of particular metro areas, and that, you know, a place like Buffalo has a very much older demographic. So our print circulation has held up better than it has in other places simply because older people are in the readership habit. Now that's obviously going to change over time. That's not a model for the future, but I think that might have something to do to explain why the coastal areas where you have a lot of people churning in and out, population changing, you know, they're just different than, you know, the old Rust Belt cities.
I'm going to try to give Tommy what he wants, which is always a good idea, I think. And also call upon somebody in the room who I know to be one of the very best regional reporters. That is Leslie Clark. Oh, that's nice. I worked with Leslie at McClatchy, and she has covered Washington for the Miami Herald, for the Lexington Herald Leader, and more. And I just wanted to ask Leslie to talk a little bit about what she sees working and what gives her hope for the future.
Thanks, Julie, I guess, I think, thanks. Okay. A lot of what I see is, Tamar mentioned it, that we at McClatchy, we're super proud of having regional reporters. We're one of probably the biggest ones in DC, and we have a number of regional reporters. I work for Kentucky now. I'm covering Mitch McConnell, which is a super fun beat, and a really important beat as well. And what we try to do as well, all my colleagues, Brian Lowery's here, a number of people are here, and we try to get something different that not everybody else is going to do. So if we know what the story of the day is going to be, it's not really what we're going to try to achieve. We're going to go somewhere else and give people what they can't get anywhere else. McClatchy sees a lot of hope in regional reporting. They have a Compass project that they're doing. People might have heard about it with Google, in which we're going into 3 news deserts that don't have any news operations in them. I think the first one is in Youngstown, Ohio, which just lost its newspaper. And they're going to sort of try something new and be brave and go in there and try to get readers, try to get people talking to them and reading them. A lot of what we do is also knowing your community. I think that's probably a really important thing. Like Jerry knows Buffalo. I knew Miami really well when I reported for Miami, and I kind of knew, always for a regional reporter, in the front of my mind is what would land on the front page. Now that's like what will land on the home page and stay there, because they'll keep the sticky stories that people will go back to. So you're always thinking, what do people in the community want to read? Now that I cover for Lexington, Mitch McConnell, the nice thing about him is he's not of interest just to folks in Lexington and Kentucky, but he's of interest to a national audience. So I think we get a lot from that. How we would change that into subscriptions, I'm not entirely sure on that, but I try to work well with the political reporters down there on it, and and keep it going. And we also, like, I focus on bourbon and horse racing and things that, you know, that the community cares about. So I think if we just try to be essential and write about things that people hopefully are interested in.
I think we have time for one more. We want to end with Mark, maybe?
Hi, all right, so I'm Mark Heller. I'm with E&E News, but I was the Washington correspondent for Watertown for 14 and a half years, and overlapped a good bit with Jerry here in the press building. I wanted to tell a quick story and then maybe make an observation. One of the beauties about regional reporting is you are tied back to your community, and that's your focus. When Watertown hired me here, I had already worked at the paper. I had been in the newsroom for 3.5 years, and they sent me down, and my editor said to me, you know, Mark, if we were looking for somebody who really knows Washington, we can find somebody in DC to do that. There are people we could hire for that, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for someone who knows the North Country. We're looking for somebody who knows people up here, who's lived in the community, who knows and understands the owner and publisher's quirks, and that sort of thing. And so that was the beauty of it. So I came down here, and as the regional, I don't care about the race for Speaker of the House. I'm not going to write about that. But I do care about whether the local congressman, John McHugh, is going to get the top slot on House Armed Services. That's a good story for us, and we'll get it first. So that's just what regional reporting is kind of all about. The observation I would make is that even though regional reporters, the ranks of us has just been decimated here, you go into the press galleries in the Capitol, and they are more full of reporters than at any time since I started here in December of 1997. And it's all people who are writing for places like E&E News and Politico, which didn't exist when I started here, and outlets like that. And so the way that the Capitol is being covered is different from what it used to be. And I don't know, I mean, these are great reporters, they're great at chasing stuff down, but the focus is different, and I would be curious about any observations maybe from people up on the stage or elsewhere about how coverage of DC has changed because of that.
If I could, and I know we want to hear from everybody, but I'll take a crack at that. There's no question but that the composition of the newsroom has changed. And a lot of them now are reporters, as you said, for energy and the environment. Or there'll be, ag, or, I don't know, infrastructure, but they're industry.
Matter, yeah.
They're subject matter, industry-oriented newsletters. And they're paid for by corporations who need to be on top of everything that is happening that could affect their bottom line. And that includes lobbyists. You know, there's now, I think Politico has a new one just devoted to what's happened in the lobbying business. That works because the consumers, although there's not a high quantity, it's a high quality in terms of capacity to pay. And they pay big money for energy newsletters. If this affects their investments, they're willing to write big checks to make sure that they are at least as informed as their competitors. But that's very different than the kind of coverage you used to have of individual members and how well they were serving their district. This is really about how well are they serving your industry. What are they doing that is going to affect your bottom line? It's a different, I think it's kind of a different paradigm through which they're viewing the work of the Congress.
And coupled with, and then I think it's probably a better question for the journalists, but coupled with the palace intrigue, how do all us little minions deal with, what's happening at the White House and how do we fit into that? And that drives Fox and MSN and all the others. So, we're the cog in the wheel for that broader nationalized narrative. That's what a lot of those reporters who chase you around. And if you want to engage in that, you can be good buddies with a lot of them. Because they need the quotes, right, to fill up the article. But if that's not your thing, if you don't want to play in that space, then you don't really have much reason as a member of Congress to talk to the reporters in the press gallery, except you're regional, right? You're better off having your comms director get the press releases back, you said fax and packs, and like, now it's by email, but like just fax it, just firing that stuff off, trying to hit the deadline for the next morning. Yeah, I voted for HR 12, and here's my floor speech,
Yeah, I find with the palace intrigue stuff and the kind of feeling like the cog in the wheel, a lot of the time, unless my congressman is really out there saying something up front, so-and-so is crazy, so-and-so is a jerk, most of the time I find that our readers don't really click on that, kind of the story of the day. Here's what Trump said, here's what our guys think of it. So in general, I find, going off of what Leslie said about just having essential stuff that no one else has. When I write about Georgia's water rights case with Florida that's in front of the Supreme Court right now, those stories do really well because no one else is really covering it. So there is a silver lining in that. You want to have the last word, Jerry?
Yeah, thanks. I'm struck at how much this conversation kind of comes full circle because I've thought a lot about what Congressman Moran here had to say about earmarks. When I came to Washington 30 years ago, I wrote about earmarks all the time. It was as if Buffalo judged its members of Congress by earmarks. Now there are no earmarks. And what's interesting is that I look at the members that I cover today, and while there are exceptions, there are some that are temperamentally very similar to the ones I covered 30 years ago. I cover a guy named Tom Reed, who I'm sure you know pretty well, who temperamentally would be the serve your district type of congressman. But without appropriations, he's taken a different path. He's worked with a bunch of other more centrist members to really energize this group called the Problem Solvers Caucus. So I end up writing stories about the Problem Solvers Caucus rather than appropriations because that's what he's doing. And so it goes into what you're saying about Congress being nationalized. It's a perfect example of it.
All right, Maureen, I'll give you the final word.
I just want to encourage everyone to look at one of the upstairs in the press club. We have front pages, and there's a longtime regional reporter dragged kicking and screaming out of my beat to a national beat last year. But while I was a regional, every time I took people to the press club, I would show them that front page in the Waco newspaper that says the local branch owner elected president.
referring to George W. Bush, which I love. Well, I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to chat with us. I want to thank our crowd for coming out. There are a ton of current and former regional reporters, including a bunch of former RRA presidents, so thank you all so much for coming. For those who paid, we have a reception upstairs, and I'd love to see you all. Thank you, and thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Tamar. Okay. Thank you, Tamar. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Andy Kohler, who's been running around with the microphone and helped make this program happen. And thank you to the press club team that always makes the experience here so welcoming and comfortable. Thank you to C-SPAN for being here, recording this and airing it. And before people leave for the reception, I do want to talk for just a minute about somebody who is not here. You may have noticed some of us wearing pins that say Free Austin Tice. Austin is the only American journalist who is being held abroad. He's been detained in Syria for 2,544 days now. He was taken while reporting for McClatchy and for the Washington Post. The U.S. government believes he is alive and is working very hard to bring him home. Austin's family has been fighting for his freedom for 7 years this month. And we hope that you will too. So we're starting a new campaign this month on Austin's birthday, which is August 11th. And you'll be able to learn more about it at askaboutaustin.org starting on August 11th. And meanwhile, you can see Austin's Syria photography in the lobby and learn more about him at austinticefamily.com. So thank you for supporting him. Thank you again for supporting programs like this. And thank you all for being here.